Catholic priests and nuns are thought of as some of the most selfless people in the world. They give up their lives in dedication to God. They sacrifice worldly possessions and intimate relationships to live a life in service of others. So when a nun was murdered right in the chapel sacristy, her killer shocked the community. More shocking would be the reason they killed. This is Monsters. Margaret Ann Pahl was born on April 6, 1908 in Edgerton, Ohio. She was the fourth of 9 children born to Frank and Catherine Pahl. Her family grew 200 acres of farmland where they grew wheat and corn and raised cows, horses, and chickens. Growing up, their home didn't have electricity, and the children would get up long before school to help start the daily chores on the farm. The family was devoutly Catholic, and her sisters said that Margaret knew from a young age that she wanted to become a nun. Her siblings said that she had a pretty normal childhood, and in 1927, when she was 19 years old, she professed her vows and joined the Sisters of Mercy at Our Lady of Pines just south of Fremont, Ohio. The Sisters of Mercy is a religious order founded in Dublin, Ireland by Sister Catherine McAuley in 1831. Their goal is to help the poor, especially women and children, by opening hospitals. The nuns in the order would end up working as nurses at those hospitals. Over the next several decades, Sister Margaret worked at a number of different hospitals, advancing in position the entire time. By the time she was 41 years old, she'd been transferred to Toledo, Ohio to run St. Charles Medical Center. Sister Margaret wasn't known to have many hobbies. She spent most of her free time devoted to the church. She did enjoy opera music and went back to Edgerton as often as she could to visit her family. Sister Margaret returned to Mercy Hospital in Toledo in 1971 and started working in the less stressful role of preparing the hospital chapel for Mass. She was 63 years old and ready to leave running the hospital to someone else. Not ready to retire, she found the hospital chapel the perfect place to remain on staff but start winding down her career. In 1981, Easter Sunday fell on the day after Sister Margaret's 72nd birthday. Her birthday fell on Holy Saturday, which changed up her schedule a bit and allowed her to sleep in a little. She lived in a dorm on the top floor of the hospital with 16 other nuns. She would normally be at the chapel bright and early to get the space ready for Mass, but there was no early morning Mass on Holy Saturday, so she didn't have to rush. When she finally made her way down into the hospital, it was pretty quiet as many of the nurses were away for the holiday. She gathered the supplies she needed from the supply area and went to the main chapel to make sure there was enough wine, communion wafers, and incense. Sister Madeline Marie Gordon was another nurse who lived in the convent on the 7th floor of the hospital. She slept in an extra hour that day, and by the time she went downstairs to eat breakfast, Sister Margaret was already in the chapel. By the time she got to the chapel that morning, it was quiet. Sister Madeline Marie was the organist for the chapel, and when she went to the organ to check on the music she wanted to play that afternoon, she noticed one of the songs was missing. She needed to call Father Gerald Robinson and ask him if he had it, so she walked over to the doors to the sacristy, but the doors were locked. It was unusual, but Sister Madeline Marie had a key and was able to open the door. That was where she found the body of Sister Margaret lying on the floor, with her dress pushed up to her chest, her undergarments pulled down, and stabbed to death. Sister Madeline Marie immediately ran out of the sacristy screaming. Coincidentally, there were 2 police officers eating in the cafeteria, and they were called to the scene. They got there at the same time as one of the hospital doctors, and when they touched her wrist to check her pulse, it was clear she was dead. From there, detectives were called in to investigate since it was clearly a homicide and looked like it also involved a sexual assault. Sister Margaret had been stabbed 31 times, and of those stab wounds, a number of them were specifically placed to make an inverted cross on her chest. Along with that, her hyoid bone was broken due to an apparent strangulation. It was believed that the strangulation killed her, and that was why there wasn't a lot of blood at the scene, something that was surprising for a murder with 31 stab wounds. Dozens of people were interviewed, which included all of the other nuns who were at the hospital that day, the assistant chaplain, and the chaplain, Father Gerald Robinson. Gerald Robinson was born on April 14, 1938 in Toledo, Ohio, the son of John and Mary Robinson. They were of Polish descent in a deeply Catholic family. People say that Mary was a particularly rigid mother. She was overly proud of her son when he decided to join the priesthood. Gerald enrolled at St. Mary's High School, which was a 4-year seminary near Detroit, about 60 miles or 96 kilometers north of Toledo. After graduating from there, he attended St. Cyril and Methodius Seminary. Both of those seminary schools were set up with the specific purpose of educating with an emphasis on Polish culture. Gerald was ordained as a priest on May 30, 1964 in Toledo and began working as an assistant at St. Adalbert's Church. He moved around to different parishes before becoming the chaplain of Mercy Hospital. On the morning of Sister Margaret's death, the hospital administrator called him in his on-site apartment and asked him to come to the chapel. He said he would get dressed and come right over, but never arrived. Eventually, detectives tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. On April 18th, Father Robinson was driven to the station and interviewed by Detective Arthur Marks for about 8 hours. The detective questioned him about every aspect of his life and his possible involvement in the crime. They brought up numerous inconsistencies in his account of his actions on the 5th, but they never got any useful information out of him. It wasn't until just before the interview was over that he blurted out, quote, "Someone came up to me on Wednesday and confessed he was responsible for Sister Margaret Ann's murder." The detective was floored. After 8 hours, he suddenly admitted to knowing who the killer was. Obviously, Detective Marks asked him who the man was, but Father Robinson wouldn't tell him. It was a privileged confession to the priest, and the priest couldn't reveal their identity. After pushing Father Robinson to reveal who the man was, the priest sighed and admitted that he lied, saying, quote, "I made that up." The detective was furious, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Father Robinson told the detective that he was tired and he wanted to go home, and he thought if he made up a killer, it would end the interview. Luckily for the priest, it was the end of the interview and he was taken home, but it wouldn't be the end of the investigation into him. The following morning, detectives arrived at Father Robinson's apartment, which he had already given them permission to search. He didn't stay there while they did, though. He had patients in the hospital to visit, so he left the detectives there to search. The autopsy had determined that the stab wounds were made with something shaped differently than a regular knife. It had a wider shape and was more unique than a knife. They had compared the wounds to a pair of scissors from the sacristy, and though they were close, the medical examiner wasn't 100% sure those were what caused the stab wounds. The ME told the detectives to look for something that might be a better fit, something they found in Father Robinson's apartment in the form of a letter opener. The letter opener was in the shape of a sword, and it looked to be a souvenir from a wax museum in Washington, D.C. When it was examined, there wasn't a speck of blood on it, but it looked like it had recently been cleaned. It didn't have a single fingerprint on it either. It wasn't until they pried off the emblem at the end of the handle did they find a tiny, pinhead-sized drop of blood that must have gotten between the emblem and the handle. The following day, Father Robinson was brought into the station for a second interview. The investigators had evidence that they wanted to use to get a confession, but first they gave the priest a polygraph. The results of the test were ultimately determined to be inconclusive, though the polygrapher stated that deception was indicated when Father Robinson was asked directly about the death of Sister Margaret. When the detectives got to the interview room, the interrogation was much shorter than the first one. They were interrupted by Deputy Police Chief Ray Vetter, Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, and Attorney Henry Herschel. They told the detectives to leave the room and then close the door. A few minutes later, all 4 men left the room and just walked past the detectives without saying a word. It was well known that Deputy Chief Vetter was a strong Catholic and Monsignor Schmidt was one of the most powerful figures in the local diocese. The interference of the Catholic Church in the investigation was no surprise. The Church held a lot of power in the area at the time, and they looked out for each other. This wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last time the Catholic Church would cover for the misdeeds of one of their priests. The local police were not innocent either, with police officers from back then stating in interviews that it was a known policy that you didn't arrest a priest at the time. The following week, Father Robinson took another polygraph, this time with a polygrapher who was chosen by his lawyer, and it was conducted at the headquarters of the Toledo Diocese. According to that polygrapher, the priest passed the test, but the results were later deemed inconclusive because there were answers that indicated emotional stress multiple times during the test. After that, the case went cold. Most people involved in the case believed they knew who had murdered Sister Margaret, but they had hit a wall that was built in front of them as they watched. Not only had Father Robinson been whisked away by people at the top, but the reports written about the case mysteriously disappeared. Sister Margaret's murder wasn't going to get solved, and it seemed that that was the way the Church wanted it. It wasn't until 2003 that the Toledo police would be informed about a woman who said she had information about Father Gerald Robinson. Sister Mary Curtis was in her early 40s and working as a teacher at a Catholic elementary school in Toledo. She revealed that she had been sexually, physically, and emotionally abused by a number of priests when she was a child. One of those priests was none other than Father Robinson. She said that the abuse had started when she was still in preschool. A priest named Father Chet Warren would come to their house to counsel her mother, and when he was done, he would encourage her to go upstairs and get some rest. Then he would abuse little Mary in her own home. That wasn't the worst of it, though, because she said there was a group of people who were part of a satanic cult that would carry out rituals in honor of Satan. In the group were 3 priests, a pediatrician, 2 female teachers, and her own father and grandfather. Starting at the age of 5 years old, she was sexually assaulted, locked in a box full of cockroaches, and forced to watch the group kill a 3-year-old girl. When she was in high school, she was regularly taken to Father Warren's apartment, where she was subjected to sadomasochistic sex. One of the people who was regularly involved in the acts of the satanic cult was Father Robinson. Despite that betrayal, she still went on to become a nun and spent decades serving the church. She was so devoted to the Catholic Church that she went there with her allegations first and resisted telling the police. She wanted to handle the issue the way the church wanted to, which would not have been in her best interest. She was eventually convinced by a counselor to talk to the proper authorities. Most of the people involved in Sister Mary's allegations have nothing to do with this story and would go on to face a variety of punishments. But most importantly here, Father Robinson was back under the spotlight of the Toledo Police Department. Detectives Steve Forrester and Tom Ross were the cold case detectives in Toledo in 2003, and once the allegations against Father Robinson were presented to them, they dug into the case and began putting the pieces together. In the box of evidence from the case was the letter opener that had been collected from Father Robinson's apartment, still with the emblem detached from where the original investigators were looking for blood. The box also contained an altar cloth that had a variety of puncture wounds and blood stains. The cloth was found outside of the chapel, but it looked as though the killer put it over Sister Margaret's body before stabbing her. When bloodstains on the cloth were compared to the letter opener, they found one that matched. The letter opener handle had a raised portion around the edge, and there were lines of blood on the cloth that perfectly matched that shape. Further analysis showed another bloodstain that perfectly matched the curve of the letter opener's blade. After interviewing an expert on the occult, investigators believed they knew how and why Sister Margaret was murdered. They believed that Father Robinson snuck up behind the nun while she was busy getting the chapel ready and strangled her. Then he pulled her body into the sacristy where he covered her body with the altar cloth. He stabbed her multiple times before placing an inverted crucifix on her chest and using it as a template to stab her in that shape. The murder was clearly meant to be a sacrifice to some dark force. The victim was one of the purest people around. Sister Margaret was so devoted to God that she wore a wedding band as a symbol of her giving her life to God. The murder was carried out on one of the most holy days and in one of the most holy places. There was a smudge of blood found on Sister Margaret's forehead, which was believed to have been from the killer anointing her with her own blood. Then, the medical examiner found abrasions on the inside of the nun's vagina, and it's believed she was violated with the crucifix before the killer fled. Detectives Forrester and Ross tracked down as many of the people who had been questioned in the original investigation as they could. Many of those people had died by then, but some were still around, and when they questioned Dr. Jack Barron, they got some interesting information. Dr. Barron had been working at Mercy Hospital on April 5, 1980, when the emergency call came over the intercom for everyone to go to the chapel. He had never been to the hospital chapel, so he took a wrong turn, and by the time he arrived, another doctor had already pronounced Sister Margaret dead. When he was interviewed by detectives, he told them everything he had seen that day, but he told detectives Forrester and Ross that something had always bothered him about the interview. He went on to explain that he had told the original detectives that he had run into Father Robinson in the hallway after he had taken the wrong turn and was headed back toward the chapel. The detectives at the time shrugged that detail off, and it had always bugged him. He wasn't the only person who had remembered seeing Father Robinson the morning of the murder either. During their interviews, 2 other people would admit to have seen him near the chapel that morning. Grace Jones, a lab tech at Mercy Hospital, started her shift early, at 4 a.m. At about 7, she went out to grab a newspaper, and as she was waiting for the elevator to go back up to the lab, she saw Father Robinson come out of the chapel carrying a duffel bag. It wasn't too long after she got back to the lab that the emergency call went out over the intercom. The other person who had seen the priest was Leslie Ann Kerr, an EKG tech. Her shift that day started at 7 a.m., and she remembered clocking in at exactly 6:50. She prepped some equipment in her office on the first floor for a few minutes, and when she went back into the hallway, she saw Father Robinson standing near the doors to the chapel. Obviously, at the time, that didn't seem out of the ordinary, so she didn't think much of it. About an hour and 15 minutes later, she heard a woman scream, and she ran out of her office to see what was happening. What she heard were the screams of Sister Madeleine Marie when she found Sister Margaret's body. Leslie said that she hadn't told the original investigators about seeing Father Robinson that morning because him being near the chapel wasn't strange. On April 23, 2004, the detectives went to Gerald Robinson's home just down the street from the police station and arrested him for the murder of Sister Margaret Ann Pahl. While Detective Ross was escorting the priest to the police station, Detective Forrester stayed behind and searched his house. There wasn't a lot there. A Catholic priest doesn't have a high salary, and most of what was in the house was not of any interest to the investigation. That was, until the detective went into Gerald's bedroom. There, on the top shelf of the closet, he found a box filled with hundreds of photos. And they were all of dead people. People in coffins, likely during their funerals. Then on a bookshelf, there was a book titled The Occult. Inside the book there were notes and passages that were underlined. There was information about something called the Black Mass and details about human sacrifice. Back at the station, Detective Ross read the suspect his rights and interrogated him. Father Robinson repeated the same story that he had told the original investigators back in 1980. He had just gotten out of the shower when he got a call about the murder of Sister Margaret. He was asked to come to the sacristy, so he finished getting dressed and hurried to the chapel. He went on to say that when he arrived at the sacristy, Father Swiatecki confronted him and said, quote, "You did this. Why did you do this?" But Father Robinson explained that he didn't know what he meant, and the assistant priest never talked to him about it. Now, Detective Ross knew something was off, because not only had 3 witnesses seen Father Robinson near the chapel the morning of the murder, before the emergency call was made, but everybody who had been at the scene after the emergency call said the same thing. Father Robinson never showed up. The interview revealed a number of inconsistencies in the priest's story, but no confession. On May 20th, Sister Margaret's body was exhumed so it could be re-examined for evidence. When the autopsy was performed, it was noted that some of the stab wounds were deep enough to have hit bone. One bone in the lower jaw had a pretty well-defined indent, and when compared to the letter opener, it was a perfect match. It was said that the letter opener fit the indent in the bone like a key in a lock. They got a second opinion from a forensic anthropologist who also confirmed the weapon was a perfect match for the wound. On September 15th, Detectives Forrester and Ross got a warrant to search the Toledo Diocese secret archives for information about Father Gerald Robinson. While there, they were given a folder that contained 148 documents regarding Father Robinson between the years of 1980 and 2003. Curiously, there was no information within that folder that had any mention of the previous or current murder investigation, something that the church would have definitely had some record of. When they returned to search another office in the church's headquarters, they left empty-handed. It was clear that the church was not interested in helping convict a murderer. The trial began on April 21, 2006 at the Lucas County Courthouse. The prosecution began by focusing on the physical evidence. That included the bone fragment with the indent that matched the letter opener. They also presented the blood-stained altar cloth with the stains that matched the handle of the letter opener. They had the testimonies of the people who were there at the time of the murder, including the hospital administrator at the time, Sister Phyllis Ann Gerald, now 76 years old, and all of the investigators involved in the case, past and present. Then the jurors heard from the witnesses who saw Father Robinson near the chapel that morning, a direct contradiction to what he had told the police. Detective Marks from the original investigation testified that Father Robinson had lied about someone confessing to the crime and then admitted he had lied. The defense relied solely on the fact that the evidence was circumstantial and that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. But like many cases, only having circumstantial evidence doesn't mean the defendant is not guilty. You have to ask yourself just how many coincidences can happen before you admit that it's not actually a coincidence. The defendant is actually guilty. The biggest witness for the defense was forensic anthropologist Dr. Kathleen Reichs, the same woman the television show Bones is based off of. She testified that photographs she examined looked like the letter opener was fit-tested prior to the bone being cleaned, which would not have produced accurate results. On cross, the prosecutor pointed out that that was the first time she had ever testified based on photos and not having examined the physical evidence. When the prosecutor called rebuttal witnesses after the defense rested, the medical examiner and the forensic anthropologists who did examine the evidence say they did clean the bone before performing the fit test. After a relatively short deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty. Gerald Robinson was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. At his age, it was essentially a life sentence. That wasn't the end of the story for Gerald Robinson, though. 5 months after his conviction, he told the media that he was innocent and began the process of appealing his conviction. His appeal was denied in July of 2008. In December of 2008, the Ohio Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. In February of 2013, the Ohio 6th District Court of Appeals denied his request for post-conviction relief. That decision was appealed, but it would never get a result. In May of 2014, Gerald suffered a major heart attack and was taken to the prison hospital. He was stabilized, and during his time in the hospital, he requested to be released as a terminal patient, but the request was denied. On July 4, 2014, Gerald Robinson died in the Columbus Prison Hospice. The Catholic Church gave the convicted murderer a funeral with full priestly rites, which upset the members of SNAP, the survivors' network of those abused by priests. They said, quote, "It's tragic for virtually everyone involved that the Catholic hierarchy is callously letting a convicted murderer go to his grave as a priest in good standing." Unfortunately, we'll never know the true reach of the evils that Father Gerald Robinson committed because records about him have been hidden by the Catholic Church. The one thing that we do know is that he died just the way he lived, as a monster. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.